My name is Teresa Solano. I'm 34 years old, and 5 weeks ago, at my parents' anniversary dinner, my brother Nico stood up with a glass of wine in his hand and told 19 people, including my parents' oldest friends, that I'd never really contributed anything financially to this family, while he'd carried the weight for years. He didn't know that 6 days earlier, an insurance adjuster had called me directly, not him, because my name was the only one listed as policyholder on every single insurance policy protecting our family's property for the last 7 years. I sat there with my fork halfway to my mouth and let the room laugh along with him for a second before I set it back down. I didn't say anything that night. I didn't need to, because in 5 weeks, the truth was going to come out through a claims file, not through an argument at a dinner table. To understand why I stayed so quiet that evening, you need to go back 7 years, to the spring my father's auto repair shop nearly lost everything, and the quiet decision I made afterward that nobody in my family ever noticed enough to ask about. Before I get into it, if you're new here, take a second to subscribe to The Quiet Reckoning. It genuinely helps this channel grow. Drop the word invisible in the comments if you've ever protected your family in a way nobody bothered to notice. I read every comment. Now let me take you back to where this actually started, because you need the full picture before any of what happened at that dinner makes sense. My father, Manny Solano, has run Solano Auto Repair in Fresno, California since 1994, a small 3-bay shop that's kept our family afloat through some genuinely hard years. Growing up, that shop was practically a second home for both of us. Nico spent his after-school hours there from the time he was old enough to hand our father a wrench, while I spent mine mostly doing homework in the small front office, occasionally helping with invoices when my father's handwriting got too tired to read by the end of a long day. Even then, the division of labor between us felt natural rather than unfair. Nico loved the physical work, the smell of motor oil, the satisfaction of a diagnosed problem fixed correctly, while I found myself drawn to the numbers side of things almost by accident, the invoices and the insurance renewal notices, and the slow, careful math of keeping a small business solvent. My brother Nico, 2 years older than me, has worked there since he was 19, first as a mechanic, then eventually managing the day-to-day operations as our father slowed down. I took a completely different path. I work as an actuarial analyst for a regional insurance carrier, a job that involves calculating risk, reading policy language most people skim past, and understanding exactly what happens when property, liability, and business interruption coverage do and don't overlap. It's not a job that comes up much at family dinners. Nico's work, visible and hands-on, always did. I mention my job because it's the reason I noticed something, 7 years ago, that nobody else in my family had thought to check. In the spring of that year, a faulty wiring issue in the shop's back bay caused an electrical fire that gutted about a third of the building overnight. Nobody was hurt. It happened at 2 a.m., but the damage was significant, close to $95,000 by the time contractors assessed it. When my father went to file the claim, he discovered, to his horror, that the shop's commercial property policy had lapsed 4 months earlier. He'd switched insurance brokers the year before during a cost-cutting push, and somewhere in the transition, the new policy had never actually been finalized, a paperwork gap nobody caught until it mattered most. I remember the exact phone call where I found out. My mother called me at 6:30 in the morning, her voice shaking, telling me the shop had caught fire overnight and that my father was already standing in the parking lot in his pajamas, staring at the scorched back wall. I drove over immediately, and I remember the specific, sick feeling of watching my father, a man I'd never once seen cry, sit down on the curb outside his own shop and put his head in his hands, when he realized, later that same morning, that there was no insurance payout coming to help him rebuild. I remember sitting at my parents' kitchen table that week, watching my father try to figure out how to rebuild a third of his shop with almost no savings and no insurance payout coming. Nico was frustrated, understandably, working double shifts trying to keep what remained of the shop functional while contractors assessed the damage, snapping at anyone who suggested the situation could have been prevented. Because I think some part of him already sensed, correctly, that a paperwork oversight was about to cost the family everything he'd spent years building his identity around protecting. Frustration didn't fix anything, though, and after the first difficult week, someone needed to actually solve the practical problem in front of us. I was the one who over the next several weeks used my industry knowledge to help my father shop for a new commercial policy properly this time, working directly with a broker I trusted from my own professional network to structure coverage that actually matched the shop's real risk profile: fire, liability, business interruption, equipment breakdown, the works. I spent evenings after my own job reading policy language line by line with my father at that same kitchen table, translating insurance jargon into plain language, making sure he actually understood what he was buying this time, instead of simply trusting whoever had sold him the last policy. The shop limped through that year on a small business disaster loan and a payment plan with the contractor, and life eventually stabilized. What almost nobody in my family registered in the chaos of that year was a small practical decision I made when the new policy was finalized. Because my father's credit had taken a hit from the disaster loan, and because I wanted to make absolutely sure this kind of lapse could never happen again, I offered to become the named policyholder on the new commercial coverage myself, paying the premiums directly from my own account and structuring automatic payments so there was no chance of another gap ever occurring silently in the background. My father agreed, gratefully, treating it at the time as a temporary fix until his credit recovered. It was never temporary. 7 years later, every renewal notice, every premium payment, every policy update for Solano Auto Repair's commercial coverage, and, as it expanded a few years later, for the small rental duplex my parents bought as a retirement investment, has run through my name and my bank account, quietly, every single month, without a single missed payment. I didn't do this for credit. I want to be honest about that. I did it because I'd watched my father's face the week the shop almost didn't survive, and I never wanted to see that look again if I could help it. I never once brought it up at family dinners. It felt to me like exactly the kind of thing you do quietly for people you love, the way Nico worked long hours at the shop without expecting a toast every time he did. The trouble is, over those same 7 years, a very different story took shape in my family about who actually contributed. Nico worked visibly every single day at the shop: early mornings, oil changes, tricky diagnostics, the physical, exhausting work that everyone could see and appreciate directly. I showed up for dinners, helped occasionally with things that looked from the outside like nothing in particular. My parents, especially my father, developed a narrative over the years that Nico was the child who'd stepped up for the family business, while I'd gone off and done my own thing, a phrase that always stung a little more than I let on, given that my own thing was, in fact, quietly keeping their business insured against exactly the kind of disaster that had almost ended it once already. I let the narrative sit uncorrected for years, partly out of genuine humility, and partly, I'll admit, out of a stubborn belief that eventually someone would notice on their own, the way you sometimes hope a partner will notice you're tired without you having to say it. That hope wore thin slowly, dinner by dinner, comment by comment, until it wore through completely 5 weeks ago. The anniversary dinner was meant to celebrate my parents' 40th wedding anniversary, a warm, genuinely happy occasion for most of the evening, held at the same Italian restaurant where they'd had their wedding reception 4 decades earlier. Nico gave a toast partway through, warm and funny for most of it, thanking our parents for their example, thanking the shop's longtime customers who'd shown up over the decades, thanking specifically his own dedication to keeping this family standing on its own 2 feet all these years. The room was warm with wine and nostalgia by that point, my father's old friends from the neighborhood laughing at old stories, my mother dabbing at her eyes more than once. Then, riding some current of pride I think he genuinely felt, Nico added, glancing briefly my way with a small, good-natured laugh that invited the table to laugh along with him. Not everybody in this family pulled their weight the same way. Teresa's never really contributed anything financially to this family, not like the rest of us who carried the weight. A few people laughed, the awkward kind of laugh that happens when nobody's sure if something's a joke. My mother glanced at me with something like sympathy, though not enough, I noticed, to say anything in the moment. My father, seated beside her, kept smiling at Nico, apparently not registering the comment as anything worth correcting. I smiled, said something forgettable about being proud of him in the shop, and let the moment pass, the way I'd let dozens of similar moments pass over the years. I didn't correct him about the policies, the premiums, the 7 years of quiet, invisible coverage sitting under my name, protecting everything he thought he alone had built and protected. I just sat there, holding information my brother had no idea existed, in a room full of people he was toasting with a story that had never once made room for mine. I want to say clearly that I didn't sit there plotting some grand reveal. I genuinely thought at that point I might just let the comment go, the way I'd let so many others go before it. What changed things wasn't anything I planned. It was a phone call 6 days after that dinner. The shop's rental duplex, the one my parents bought as a retirement investment 8 years ago, suffered a significant kitchen fire in one of the units. A tenant's stove malfunction, nobody hurt, but real damage, close to $40,000 by the initial estimate. Because I was the listed policyholder on the property's coverage, the insurance adjuster, a methodical man named Gordon Reyes, called me directly to begin processing the claim, walking me through the standard timeline, the documentation needed, the payout structure once the assessment was finalized. Nico called me an hour after Gordon's call, having heard from our parents that the insurance company was handling the claim, apparently under the assumption that this simply meant our father's usual broker relationship, the way it always had before the shop fire 7 years ago rearranged everything quietly behind the scenes. "Hey, I guess we need you to walk Dad through the insurance stuff since you know that world," he said, a little offhand, still not fully understanding what he was actually asking. "I'm already handling it," I told him. "I'm the policyholder on the duplex. Gordon called me directly an hour ago." There was a pause long enough that I could hear him processing it. "Wait, what do you mean you're the policyholder? Since when?" "Since the shop fire, 7 years ago," I said. "When Dad's credit took a hit after the disaster loan, I took over as the named insured on the commercial policy so it would never lapse again. When Mom and Dad bought the duplex a few years later, I did the same thing for that policy too. I've been paying the premiums myself this whole time." The silence on the other end of the line went on long enough that I actually checked to see if the call had dropped. "7 years, he finally said. "You've been paying for insurance on the shop and the duplex for 7 years, and nobody said anything?" "I didn't think it needed announcing," I said. "I did it because I didn't want to watch Dad lose the shop again the way he almost did. I wasn't looking for credit." "You let me stand up at that dinner and say you never contributed anything," he said, his voice tightening now, less defensive and more something closer to genuine distress. "In front of everyone. Teresa, why didn't you just say something?" "Honestly, Nico, I kept waiting for someone to ask," I said. "For 7 years. Nobody ever did." My father called that same evening, having clearly heard some version of the conversation from Nico. He was quiet for a long moment on the phone before he said, "Teresa Bell, is this true? You've been the one paying for the insurance this whole time?" I told him yes, plainly, and walked him through the timeline the same way I had Nico, the lapse, the fire, the decision I'd made quietly to prevent it from ever happening again. He didn't say much right away. Then he said, "I thought your mother had been covering that from our account. I never once thought to check whose name was actually on it." I told him it was okay, that I hadn't done it expecting anyone to check. The claims process for the duplex took about 4 weeks from start to finish, methodical and unremarkable in the way insurance claims usually are when the underlying coverage is actually solid. Gordon walked me through each stage patiently: an initial site inspection to document the extent of the kitchen damage, a review of the tenant's stove maintenance records to rule out negligence disputes, a repair estimate from a contractor the insurance company approved, and finally, a payout calculation that accounted for both the immediate repair costs and a few weeks of lost rental income while the unit sat vacant during repairs. I found myself, more than once during those calls, quietly grateful for my own professional background, not because I needed it to understand the process, but because I could tell, listening to Gordon's careful explanations, how confusing and overwhelming this same conversation would have been for my father 7 years ago, without someone in the family who already spoke this particular language. Proper documentation, a fair assessment from Gordon, a payout that covered the repair costs without complication, precisely because the policy had been maintained correctly and consistently for years, without a single lapse. Exactly the outcome I'd quietly engineered 7 years earlier, so my family would never again stand in a burned-out building, wondering how they'd afford to rebuild it. Nico came by my apartment about 10 days after that phone call, which surprised me since we've never been the kind of siblings who show up unannounced. He stood in my doorway for a moment before I let him in, looking, for the first time in longer than I could remember, genuinely unsure of himself, still in his shop uniform with grease still faintly visible on his forearms, like he'd driven over straight from closing up for the day, rather than waiting until he'd had time to rehearse anything. "I've been sitting with this for over a week," he said. "I think I built this whole story in my head, for years, about who was actually holding this family together, and I never once checked if it was true. I said something awful to you at that dinner, in front of everyone, and I need to actually apologize for it, not just feel bad about it privately." I told him I appreciated him saying that, and that I hadn't done any of it to make him look bad or to prove a point. I genuinely just wanted to protect Dad's shop, and later the duplex, from ever facing what it faced that first year. He asked quietly why I'd never told him directly, and I gave him the most honest answer I had. "I think some part of me wanted you to notice on your own. That's probably not fair to put on you. I could have just told you 7 years ago and saved us both this whole mess." We talked for almost 2 hours that afternoon, longer and more honestly than we had in years. He told me at one point that working at the shop every day had made him feel like the only one who understood what it took to keep the family financially afloat, and that some part of him had needed that story to stay true, because it gave shape to years of long, physically exhausting work that didn't always feel appreciated either. I understood that more than I expected to. We'd both, in our own quiet ways, been carrying something the other one couldn't fully see. He asked me, near the end of that visit, whether I resented him for all those years of comments, the small jabs about my real job versus his hands-on work, the assumption baked into every family conversation that his contribution was the visible, countable one, and mine was somehow optional. I told him honestly that I had at times, though I'd rarely let myself sit with it fully, because it felt easier to absorb the comments quietly than to make an issue of something that felt, on its face, so much smaller than it actually was. "I think I let it accumulate instead of addressing it," I said. "That's probably as much my responsibility as yours." He didn't try to argue me out of that, which I appreciated more than I expected to. 5 weeks have passed since that dinner. My father insisted about 2 weeks ago on transferring the commercial policy and the duplex policy formally into a joint arrangement, splitting the premium responsibility between himself and me going forward. Not because he had to, but because, in his words, a man should know exactly what's protecting his own business and who's been protecting it for him. I agreed, mostly because I think it mattered to him to finally participate directly in something he'd quietly assumed for 7 years was simply being handled by forces he never needed to understand. We sat together at the broker's office for the transfer paperwork, and I watched my father read through the policy language himself this time, slowly, carefully, the way I'd once taught him to at that same kitchen table 7 years earlier, only now doing it because he wanted to, not because a fire had forced him to. Nico has started asking me actual questions now, about coverage types, about what business interruption insurance even means, the kind of questions that suggest he's genuinely trying to understand a part of running the shop he'd never had to think about before. Last week he called just to ask what would happen to the shop's coverage if he ever took over as the primary policyholder himself someday, a question that would have been unthinkable for him to ask a few months earlier. It's a small shift, but it's a real one, the kind of change that happens slowly, in ordinary conversations, rather than in any single dramatic moment. I think about that dinner sometimes, and I don't feel real anger toward Nico anymore, even after what he said in front of everyone. I think he built an entire understanding of his own value in this family around the visible, physical work he did every single day. And I think some part of him genuinely needed to believe he was the only one holding things together, because that belief gave meaning to years of early mornings and exhausting labor. I don't think that makes what he said at that dinner okay. I just think it makes it a little easier to understand why a story like that can survive 7 years without anyone bothering to check if it was true. I've thought too about my own part in letting that story survive as long as it did. I could have corrected it years ago at any one of dozens of dinners where some version of "Teresa never really contributes" got said in passing, half joking, easy to let slide. I didn't, and I've had to sit honestly with why. Part of it was genuine humility, the belief that quiet acts of care shouldn't need announcing to count. But part of it, if I'm being fully honest with myself, was a kind of test I didn't admit to running, a hope that someone in my family would eventually ask the right question, notice the pattern, care enough to check. Nobody did, for 7 years. And I think that's worth sitting with too, not just as something that happened to me, but as something I quietly allowed to keep happening by staying silent. My mother, in one of the more surprising conversations to come out of all this, told me a few weeks ago that she'd always assumed, in some vague, unexamined way, that my father simply handled all the insurance matters himself, the way he'd handled most of the shop's finances for as long as she'd known him. She said she felt embarrassed realizing she'd never once thought to ask who was actually behind the policy renewals arriving every year, the automatic payments that never once caused a problem, the reason the family had felt, for 7 years, quietly and reliably protected without anyone having to think about it. I think that's the trouble with things that work perfectly, she said. Nobody ever asks how. If you're watching this and you've ever protected the people you love quietly, without asking for credit, only to watch someone else get praised for standing closer to the fire than you ever did, I want you to hear this, because I spent 7 years believing that quiet was the same thing as generous, and I'm no longer sure those are always the same thing. Invisible protection is still protection. The people who quietly make sure the roof stays over everyone's head rarely get toasted at anniversary dinners, but the house is still standing because of them, every single time it matters. If this story meant something to you, tell me in the comments about a time you protected your family quietly, and nobody noticed until it actually mattered. And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe. New stories go up every week here on The Quiet Reckoning. There's another one waiting for you, about a woman whose parents told the bank she'd never contributed to the family home. The same week, the mortgage records proved she'd been the one making every single payment for 6 years.